I've always thought it was best if vaccines could be made in a manner where they are given in the same way that the disease itself is caught. Now, there's a next gen COVID vaccine that involves a nasal spray as opposed to a shot, and it's not messenger RNA based either. So let's talk about it. Hey everybody, it's Dr. David. I'm a board certified pediatrician in Tampa, Florida. I've been on the forefront of vaccines and in particular COVID vaccines since the original use authorizations. The emergency was put out there when I presented to the FDA on both the Pfizer, the Moderna, as well as the pediatric versions of the vaccines, and gave my opinions as to things I really think that they needed to take account of, which unfortunately they did not. But today we're going to be talking about this new form of vaccine that is being created. It's in very early right now. It's not any large kind of studies, but I think it is kind of fascinating. And now, before we talk about that, I do want to speak a little bit about some of the shortcomings of the current messenger RNA version of the COVID vaccine in particular. First of all, there was no induction of mucosal immunity. Now, typically, when we get a virus, we typically breathe it in. Few exceptions to that, but usually it's through our nasal passages, or maybe we swallow it. Okay. Now, the lining of our intestinal tract, the lining of our nose, our lungs, etc., is what's referred to the mucosa. And what happens when a person gets a disease, they would naturally then put antibodies on those surfaces to serve as future protection as a first line when a person were to see that virus or bacteria in some senses again. But when a person does it as a shot, that does not happen. And that's true for most of the vaccines that are out there, including the messenger RNA vaccine. Second thing that happened is that the mRNA vaccines only produced the spike protein, which is one of but many different proteins on the surface of the of the virus. And when a person were to catch the wild disease, when a person developed natural immunity, wild immunity to COVID, they developed antibodies against all of the different proteins that are on the surface, not just the spike protein. Now, when there started to be variants formed, there was mutations happening in the coding for the spike protein. And that's why the virus started to be able to go around the vaccine, because there was change enough in the protein on the newer variants on the spike protein that the antibodies that were made from the vaccine did not have wonderful immunity against it. That's the reason why they've had these boosters, these updates in the vaccines, where they're trying to catch ahead of time the version of the spike protein that would be coming up, or that's in circulation now. But what we saw over and over is that there would still be variants, and then that vaccine would only work for a period of time. And there's no reason to think that that wouldn't be happening with the new booster that was just released for COVID, SARS-CoV-2. Now, in addition to that, not just the natural immunity from that happens when you then have protection afterwards with those antibodies, the mucosal immunity, but also when a person catches a natural virus, there is something called the innate immune response. It's not specific to that particular virus, but the body recognizes viral infected cells, and it starts creating things like natural killer cells, other types of white blood cells, that even before we start to make antibodies, we're already starting to mount an immune response. But that does not happen when a person gets an injection, because it bypasses, again, that mucosal exposure, and therefore it's only an immune response that happens once the shot and once the protein starts to be made. But those are different antibodies. On the surface of our lining, that mucosal immunity, it's called secretory IgA. Secretory IgA is not produced when a person gets a vaccine. What gets produced is IgM and then IgG, which IgG being the longer term immunity, IgM being the first antibody that is produced when you first start to see an infection. Now, in terms of the new vaccine that is being developed, first of all, it's not messenger RNA. So the concern that some people have regarding mRNA vaccines, or one of the concerns, is that when a person gets an mRNA vaccine, it's not specific as to how much antigen, in this case spike protein, gets made, because different people may make more or less particles of spike protein with one particle of messenger RNA. All other vaccines that are not messenger RNA, you know exactly how much antigen is produced. And therefore, it's solid that way. Now, of course, different people may still have different immune responses to it, but it's one less variable because everybody gets the same amount with those other types of vaccines. And that would be something that would happen if this nasal vaccine were to come to market, because there's the exact amount that's per spray. Now, in terms of that, and to be clear, there's no big trials that have been done. So this is very preliminary. And again, something may fall apart, may find something unexpected that makes us not be going forward with this version. But right now, this is what we're talking about. Now, as far as this, it's a spray in the nostril, one dose. It's not felt that boosters are going to be needed, but also there's no needle. And for people who are needle phobic, that could be a benefit to them. Now, when it comes to the nasal spray, because it is to the nasal lining, it's just like the wild virus in terms of all of the immune response that's going to happen when a person is exposed. Now, what they're showing so far is that the immunity lasts for at least a year. And it could be very much longer than that. We just don't know because they haven't been studying this long enough. It may not be. We'll find out. We were told that the mRNA vaccine would last a long time. Turns out that the protection was massively falling away from being protected within a couple months. Some people say within 60 days that the vaccine was only providing a short-term protection. Now, they've also shown that this nasal spray, which would be expected because of how it does, creates both the humoral, we call humoral immunity, that is the antibody response, as well as cellular immunity, which is the white blood cell response. And you kind of expect it because, again, that's what happens in nature. And of course, then this form, because it has all of those different proteins in it, not just spike protein, it's much more broad immunity. So if you remember during COVID, we were talking about how there was a second antibody that one could test for called the nucleocapsid antibody. And that was something that would tell us if it was present that a person had received and has wild natural immunity because the vaccine was only making against the spike protein. So that would be a similar type of thing, but it would be even more than just that. And of course, the wild virus would give us all those other protein exposures as well, but that's what this would do as well. But one of the interesting things is because there's all these other antigens, there'd be much less susceptibility to variants, to those types of mutations that occurred that made the mRNA vaccines not work so well over time. But also, they've actually shown that it neutralizes not just SARS-CoV-2, but there was a previous SARS. You may have heard, of course, if there was SARS-CoV-2, there had to have been a SARS-CoV-1. But it's showing good protection because a lot of those proteins, whether it's SARS-CoV-1 or SARS-CoV-2, would be the same on the virus, which also would mean that if there becomes a SARS-CoV-3, which, let's face it, there's a good chance of that once there's been a 1 and a 2. We certainly can't say there won't be a 3, but there's a good chance that there could be protection developed for that as well. Now, there are other vaccines where we do give them in the way that nature intended it, such as tetanus, right? It's a puncture. Maybe that's a great way to give tetanus vaccine. However, it's part of the pertussis and diphtheria, which are inhaled versions. And so, again, those are shots, so those wouldn't get natural immunity or that naturally produced immunity. Now, polio is very fascinating because when the first vaccine, like a century ago, came out, it was an injected form. They then found that an oral form was much more efficient because the oral form, since polio is caught through fecal oral transmission, that the oral form would create the natural immunity similar to like we're talking about with this one with the nasal spray. And it was incredibly effective, pretty much knocked out polio completely. The reason why they went back to the shot version for polio is because there were 8 to 10 people nationally who did develop polio from that vaccine, the oral form. And when there were only cases of polio from the vaccine and none from nature, that's when they went back to the shot form because they figured, well, why risk it for those 8 to 10 people now that almost everybody has immunity? The nasal flu shot, same thing. Nasal immunity, the flu mist does the same thing. But of course, most vaccines that are given to people are by shot and therefore not creating a natural immune response. So what needs to be done still? So first of all, of course, we need to make sure that similar to polio, that if this does come to fruition, that it can't cause disease in anybody. Okay, doesn't mean it can't cause side effects, but in terms of the actual catching of the disease, we want to make sure about that, especially in immunocompromised people, because that was more likely who it was happening for the polio. Now, as far as we also want to make sure that if this does go forward, and we wouldn't see this until we have larger studies done. Again, it wouldn't be an emergency authorization, and therefore they should go through the normal of taking years to develop research, develop study, etc., the vaccine. But we need to make sure that it doesn't create any kind of hyperinflammation or autoimmunity like a lot of vaccines do. And if it does, how likely is that to happen? How severe is that to happen? And of course, we need to know overall if it does have a different impact on people who do have immunocompromised medical conditions. So, it's something interesting to talk about. And let me know what you think. Does this sound like it would be something that you would be interested in taking for you and your family if it did bring this different kind of immunity and does what is kind of being said it would do? Or, I realize that there's some people who probably will never take any kind of vaccine out there. And of course, I would like to hear what your thoughts are about this too. So, hope you learned something new, and we'll see what happens in the future. Have a nice day.